Hello, and welcome to a new podcast series, Collections Conversations, sponsored by our friends at C&R Software. I've always been fascinated by collections, perhaps to an unhealthy degree. As you know, I'm a lending nerd in my heart of hearts, and within the lending lifecycle, I think collections and recovery is perhaps the best place to learn, to understand what specific lenders are doing, the trade offs they're making, and the ways in which lending is being transformed by technology. After all, as the wise man says, giving out money is easy, getting it back is hard. For the first episode in our series, I talked to Naeem Abraham, Senior Director at C&R Software. Now, full disclosure, I know the folks at C&R very well. Many of us used to work together at a prior company back in the day. I know how they think about the intersection of debt collection, financial health, and technology. And while I had never met Naeem before this podcast, you'd never know it from our conversation because we are extremely aligned in how we think about collections. The focus of our conversation was on collections in the age of AI, and we talk a lot about that in very specific terms: use cases, regulations, when to build, when to buy, etc. However, our conversation also goes in some deeper, almost philosophical directions at times, which was really fun. We asked questions like, will we even call it collections 10 years from now? Now, at this point, I know I've hooked you, so let's just jump right in. Here is episode 1 of Collections Conversations, featuring Naeem Abraham. Okay, well, Naeem, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Alex, for having me.
I am delighted to have you, sir. The focus of our conversation is collections in the age of AI, which is something I have written about. I believe it's something that you've written about. I know you talk about it with clients and with folks in the ecosystem all the time. So I feel like we have a lot to get to. I want to start by talking a little bit about sort of how the moment we're in now is kind of fundamentally different from where we've been before. And just to set the context for this a little bit, and this is something I always try to do whenever I'm talking about AI, anything. AI is a term that's been used for a very long time. Candidly, vendors have used it in their marketing for a very long time to oversell what it is they do. And in the context of collections and debt collections, I mean, there's lots of uses of AI that we've had for a long time, right? We use machine learning for tasks like propensity modeling to figure out who to call and who's going to self-cure. Like, we've used a lot of this technology in debt collections for a long time. And yet, at the same time, I do think that much like other areas of financial services, and you can tell me if I'm off base here, but in the collections area, the sense I get is that everyone is kind of looking at AI as we currently talk about it with large language models and generative AI and transformers. Mm-hmm. And they see something that is fundamentally different than the types of techniques and technologies we've been using in the past. And that the use cases or the places where we might apply it are a little bit different. So I'm wondering if you can just comment on that and kind of talk about why what we are talking about with AI today is sort of fundamentally different than what we've historically talked about in collections.
Yeah. So if I almost want to start probably 20 to 30 years ago, right, where it was one size fits all. And then we focused on start of predictive analytics, right? Started to analyze some data, started to forecast and go into predictive analytics, segment and prioritize. But that was really to operationalize and optimize operational efficiency, right? And we've had good success there, right? So it was really about getting the segment. This is what I need to do within this segment. This is what I need to do after. So it was really around who, but focus on how do we get efficiently to the best outcome. Generative AI, right? I don't necessarily think competes with that, but complements it rather nicely, because now we can focus on content creation, the conversational interaction, and not just the predictive stuff. So now I know who I need to contact. Now I know who are the highest risk customers and what customer preferences are like. But now I can have human-like dialogue and use that reasoning to be able to start pushing that extra that I wasn't able to do before, analyze all of
Mm.
the information and start using the right response, the right languages to be able to get clients feeling comfortable and reaching the desired outcome. And again, that's still within the correct segments. I wouldn't say this is a blanket rule, right? I always
Hmm.
think we have to start with the client and the customer.
Hmm.
With AI, there's always this seduction to go and go into the technology and just marvel at the
Yeah.
technology. But really, what we're solving for is the customer and the client, and that's
Mhm.
the eye. That's the prize that we have to keep our eye on.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well put. I find constantly in fintech and in banking that we are sort of putting the cart before the horse and going like, "Wow, look at this technology! It's amazing," and it
Yeah.
is. And as we'll talk about, it can do some amazing things. It also is flawed in some pretty incredible and interesting ways that are also really important to kind of keep in mind. But at the end of the day, you're right. Like, it's just another tool, and the question is, how do we apply it? And I like the way you framed it as this is in a lot of ways kind of building on top of and deeply complementary to the type of kind of AI or machine learning that we were using before, right? And I love the framing of before we were using it to kind of figure out, and we're still using it this way to figure out who should I contact?
Yeah.
Like what are the different segments? Who should I reach out to? Which ones are higher risk? Which ones are lower risk? Which ones will sort of need this type of nudge versus this type of nudge? Like it was a who segmentation question, which by the way, traditional machine learning techniques are very, very good at. And I think generative AI is probably not that
Yeah.
good at. That's not really what it's designed to do. But the constraints, and maybe I want to jump down a little bit to talk about kind of the potential benefits of debt collection with generative AI. The constraint in collections has always been resource constraints, right? Operational efficiency. You have a limited number of collection agents, which means that you have to be very strategic in where and how you deployed your resources to be more efficient, right? I've always sort of felt like collection shops sort of approach the problem of, look, we've kind of been dealt a losing hand because we don't have as many resources as we would ideally need.
Yeah.
But with that losing hand, like, what do we do? And so, like, a classic example is, if we predict you're going to self cure, that's an easy opportunity to just not waste any resources on you. And then, oh, we're adding in these digital collection communication capabilities, which aren't the same as talking to a human being and can't be quite as sort of empathetic and flexible in the way that they interact with you. But if you just need a simple nudge, they might do. And let's save our collection agent for over here. But it was very much a game of like limited resources and figuring out how to apply them. I, in my newsletter, have sort of called debt collection in the age of generative AI like collections abundance moment. And what I mean by that is that resource constraint thing. I'm not going to say it entirely goes away, but it significantly changes. So I'm curious if you can kind of articulate from your perspective, like, how do you think generative AI will change not so much like tactically what we do, but
Mhm.
more like strategically how collection shops approach their job?
And that is a question that we've posed and we discussed, to death, to be honest, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it always comes back to the same answer, right? What do I still need to do to add value to my organization, right? I need to get better risk outcomes from a collections point of view, right? That's fundamentally. I need to have a great customer experience and I have to watch my costs, right? And this was almost I always call it like a triangular dance floor, right? And I could only be at one point in the dance floor at any point in time. So if I erred on, I want to, cut costs, usually my risk outcome suffered, my client experience definitely suffered.
Mm.
And I think that is still the price, right? However, AI gives us an opportunity that we didn't ordinarily have. We used to think about things about like, ooh, wouldn't it be great if everyone had a personal banker? Ooh,
Yeah.
well, hold on. That's actually starting to become a reality. So
Yeah.
it allows us now to reimagine collections. And I don't like predictions, but I would say that the term collections will fall away, right? And
Mm.
financial well-being is the actual price, right? And
Mm.
because that now starts giving us better risk outcomes, better cost
Mm-hmm.
outcomes, and better client experience at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that allows us to now start fundamentally understanding our customer lifetime value, right? And shift that into our thinking. So now collections fall away. And what we focus on is financial well being. So now just think about that example of everyone, having a personal banker. That was a great idea, still is a great idea, but the cost was prohibitive. I mean, how many people would you have to employ? How much of time would be consumed by it? It just didn't make sense economically. Now, right, every single person can have a personal banker. It's just automated via an AI agent. Now, that fundamentally shifts the thinking in terms of, okay, what can I use this for? Where can I use this for? And the way I would like to see this is not, just be in a collection context, but really think about the bigger prize is how do I move into proper financial well-being? How do I have human supervisors? How do I move into more prevention? And that starts increasing the scale a lot more, starts blurring the line with, proper servicing. But it's an exciting time. And I think that's the potential of where we wanted to move with collections all along, but now it's just so much easier.
It's a really, really great point, and I wanna dive into that a little bit before we get to the next part of our conversation, because you hit on a bunch of stuff that is interesting to me, and quite frankly, that I'm very passionate about. So one of the things you said there that I think is really interesting is that this idea that cost is sort of forcing our hand a little bit historically in collections, and I think to put a fine point on that, the way I think about it, and be curious for your reaction to this is cost concerns from a collection standpoint sort of force us to be more adversarial with customers than we would ordinarily want to be. And what I mean by that is, like, if you think about, and I've always thought about collections as sort of a customer journey, right? Where it starts well before the customer has a problem, everything is going along great. Then they start to maybe hit a bump in the road or something unexpected happens. Everything from that all the way to we're charging off the debt, we're maybe trying to recover it on behalf of a debt buyer or a third party, like that whole journey end to end. The question is really like, where do you want to engage with the customer, and what are the costs of doing so, right? And I think you framed it exactly the right way. We call it collections because in our brains, we sort of made this assumption that, well, look, we can't get involved in really working with the customer until something bad has happened and they owe us money they haven't paid, and then we have to collect it. That's why we call it collections. Right. But when you reframe it as, financial well-being or servicing, what you're saying is, look, if we can take cost off the table and we could just say, look, ideally, what would we want to do that would be best for us from a risk perspective and best for the customer in terms of their outcomes? What would we want to do? How would we design it? It is that personal banker in your pocket thing, right? Where it's like, hey, we want to have someone talking to the customer all the time. We want them to be totally tied to what's going on in the customer's lives. And as soon as anything happens that might impact their ability to make a payment or to keep up with not just our obligation, but like all of their obligations in their lives, we want to help them navigate that moment and ideally get to a place where they resolve it. We're happy from a risk perspective. They're happy. And we strengthened the brand and the relationship that we have with this customer. I mean, like that, it's so funny. In the old days, we used to call that pre-collections, Naeem, which is such a stupid term to use because it's like we're going to get involved before something went wrong, but we're calling it the thing that we call it when something goes wrong. Right. So am I sort of categorizing this like mindset shift correctly? Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And cost drove the humanization out of collections, right? Because it became an operational powerhouse. I need to get the outcomes, right? And I need to do it as much as possible with very limited resources. And what is going to suffer is, that humanization, that client experience. We speak about it a lot and we talk a good game. We actually value our customers until they have a problem. Then we value, getting our stuff back.
Yes.
And I think that can fundamentally shift. I think it's fundamentally shift over the past 10 years in terms of thinking, that more and more customer centricity came into mind. And that was great because it started to get more competitive and customer lifetime value was great collections wasn't, this is a bad customer and they're going to stay bad for life. People have bumps on the road. That doesn't make them a bad customer. It just means I need to focus on an alternative sort of assistance or treatment. And it started to become this bigger picture. Cost always drove it down to the reality of what we needed to do. And now we are on the precipice of being able to say, well, that becomes less and less of an issue if we implement AI in the right way. And how do we leverage that? Not to just tweak our existing processes and strategies, but reimagine them.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And I want to double click onto one other thing you said there, which is this mindset shift, right? Because I think one of the hardest things about technology and adapting to technology is when new capabilities come in, and generative AI is a perfect example of something that fundamentally changes the cost equation in a way that really reframes the entire job in a pretty fundamental way. I mean, when I look across all of financial services, I don't think I see any area where the basic blocking and tackling of what you're supposed to be doing day to day is going to change in a meaningful way than in collections with generative AI, as we've been discussing. But as you also just illustrated there, and you come from this world, so maybe you can help me get a kind of an inside glimpse at what this looks like. It sounds like the culture change has already begun even in advance of generative AI getting there. And I want to understand a little bit more what's behind that, because I've sensed the same thing, right? To your point, like over the last 10 years, when I've talked to collections professionals, they are much more customer centric in their thinking. Maybe not necessarily in their tactical decision making day to day, because there's still the cost realities they have to deal with, but in their thinking about, like, if you asked them how they wanted to do their job, they were thinking more in customer centric terms, which was very different than, like, I don't know, 20 years ago when you talked to someone who worked in collections and they were just an operational machine that just existed to optimize from an efficiency and a cost perspective. What's been driving that mindset shift? Obviously, it's not the technology. It was something else. Was it sort of more of a focus on customer lifetime value? Like what things in the industry sort of started catalyzing that mindset shift?
I think there's a few things. I think the rise of the consumer actually understanding their role in this. Before, banks were doing me a favor, and now it's, well, hold on, you're doing banks a favor by being a customer, right? Because there's so much of competition out there. So I think having that mind shift change, the customer understood a lot of their power. The competition started to increase. It wasn't just a few legacy banks that, mulled around the same. There were a lot of competitors that came into that space, which is absolutely drives the right kind of outcomes. And regulation, right? Regulators start saying, well, you've got to think about whether you want to or not. You're going to start thinking about your customer. And it just started making sense. And then you start thinking about, well, customer lifetime value, how consumers have changed. And it's not like you have one hit at credit, and if you strike out, you're blacklisted for life. That isn't the case anymore. So I think those factors combined, it just makes business sense, right? And I know there's a lot of people who it was absolutely, we want to do the right thing. And I applaud that thinking. But coupled with that, there's a strong business case on why you need to do it as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's funny, the business case point, just one thing I'll add to that, and then we'll jump to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is I noticed a lot of the early innovations in more customer-centric collections, ironically starting in like debt recovery, like very, very late stage. And it's kind of funny, but I think the reason I noticed that, at least my theory, was that at that point, you kind of have nothing to lose because your odds are so low that it's like, well, why don't we try being nicer to the customers, or why don't we try a more empathetic tone, or why don't we try to like leverage, and this was in the age of like, digital collections capabilities coming on board, and it being a little bit more, not like generative AI can do, but a little bit more tailored to the individual from a communications perspective, and sort of emphasizing flexibility and empathy and those kind of things. And lo and behold, even consumers who were deep into debt and were sort of trying to dig themselves out and are in sort of a bunker mindset where they don't want to be contacted by anyone, that really worked and that stood out. And so it's funny how sometimes these ideas will kind of take root in the far corners of the industry and then kind of
Yeah.
migrate their way backwards a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's to your earlier point, collections became this operational powerhouse
Yeah.
and the humanity was lost. Recoveries, when you're talking about a legal claim, when you're talking about attaching a person's property or their vehicle,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more personal, actually, very much more
Totally.
personal. So,
Totally.
again, that was kind of forced upon, well, you've got to hand this more empathetically, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to go and put this car into a tree on over a cliff. It's my asset now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, some of it forced, right? But some of it
Mm-hmm.
absolutely about, trying the right thing and doing it in the right areas.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
absolutely.
No, that makes sense. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to what I mentioned before, which are the challenges with this technology. And I always try to be honest whenever I talk to people about AI, and I think you take a similar approach, right? In the sense that these new capabilities are absolutely incredible. However, anyone who uses ChatGPT on a regular basis, I think, as many of us do, or Gemini, or Claude, or Grok, or whichever chatbot you use, for every moment of brilliance, you will also run into these moments where you're like, "How are you not understanding this? Well, how are you screwing this up? How can you not count the number of bees and blueberries? Like this is bizarre. Like how can it be so intelligent and capable and yet also so dumb at the same time?" And of course, the answer to that, which I think society is still having a hard time wrapping our heads around, to be honest with you, is these are fundamentally different tools than what we used to call AI or that we use for decisioning or for automation, right? Most computer systems are deterministic in nature, meaning they're fairly predictable as you use them. These large language models are probabilistic, meaning that the outputs are statistical in nature. They're not always going to be exactly the same. Um, I know you talk to lenders and talk to collection shops all the time about this kind of stuff. How do you kind of talk them through the sort of challenges of dealing with these probabilistic models and designing systems around them? Because again, like as we were just talking about, it makes so much sense in the world to leverage what these things are good at to kind of fundamentally change how collections works and how companies approach collections and even whether we should be calling it collections anymore. But you can't just blindly hand processes over to these large language models or replace human beings with them. So, like, how do you talk to them about, from a systems architecture perspective, like getting the most value out of them while minimizing the downside?
Yeah. I think there's a few things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this might sound like a rehearsed answer, but it's largely because we've had this conversation so many times. But
I was going to say, yeah.
let's take a sports analogy, right? You
Mm-hmm.
see a wonderful play, be it football, be it any sort of soccer. You see this
Mm-hmm.
wonderful play, and you see the iceberg effect. You see the tip of it. You see the pass. You see the run. You see
Mm-hmm.
the goal being scored, and it's a thing of beauty. What we
Mm-hmm.
don't see, right, is the
Mm-hmm.
training. What we don't
Mm-hmm.
see is running that play over and over again in that training. What we don't
Yeah.
see is the scouting report that said this is the perfect player that complements the team. We don't
Mm-hmm.
see all of those foundationals that are actually being built to reach that moment of greatness. Now, the seduction of AI is, again, and it's very seducing, is the fact that, ooh, I can do this in 7 minutes. I've built an app. I'm so happy with it, right? But
Mm-hmm.
you can't deploy that, right? It's
Mm.
great. It's a POC. It's wonderful, but would you expose this directly to your customers? No. So I think it's largely the reality around, okay, right, there's some foundations that we have to do this to make this not only valuable, but sustainable, right?
Mm.
You need to focus on value, right? Don't work on the tech. I think Steve Jobs always used to mention this. Don't work from the tech to the product or the solution. Work from the need and the customer back to what you need to provide. And that's the value you need to focus on. The tech will be whatever tech it is to support it, right? So within that, right, there's foundational principles and there's best practices, and I can list so many, right? But It's really around having the right sort of guardrails, right? So that's the first thing you want to do, right? Is you want to make sure that you can do that. And a lot of people think the agentic framework in isolation from machine learning and predictive analytics, guess what? In the world of guardrails, right, a decision engine is your best friend, right? Where I need an explainable, transparent kind of reason for a specific decision, especially high impact, that's what I'm going to call on and use it. And using an AI agent and bringing in a decision engine gives you hard guardrails, right? Upon multiple layer validations. Now, how do we reimagine this, right? Why do I have to do QA after the fact? Well, if I have an AI agent, I can pass on what I want to do to a QA agent at that point in time and get an answer of, is this at the level that you expect? So multiple layer validations work. Um, the third is probably data, right?
Mm.
And it does not get talked about nearly enough, right? The the companies that have an edge are the companies that are obsessing about the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk more about that, but have proper knowledge bases for your documents, have proper data, evaluate models, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talk a lot about everyone wants to treat this like a science,
Yeah.
right? But it's a lot more art at the moment, and we're going through
Mm-hmm.
a change in the evolution, right? I don't like the word transformations because transformations is something you do to try and push it along, but we are evolving. And right now,
Mm-hmm.
it's about evaluating how we evolve. What's the right model? That could change, right? And so with that, right, you have the right time of monitoring, right? You could have
Mm-hmm.
AI drift. An agent functions brilliantly today, but over time that erodes because
Mm-hmm.
the context changes. So you got to think about, well, how do I monitor this, right? Where do I put in human oversight? Where is it human in the loop? Where do I have the override capabilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even on top of that, BCP, right? It's something that fundamentally isn't part of the discussion, but yet just imagine I have all of these autonomous agents working so well in a low cost environment and the system shuts down. What do I do for those hours? Previously, we would reorganize the call center, we'd get some training happening, we would do different things to make the time valuable. So those things need to happen. So the way back to the question, there's all of these foundational things that need to happen to build it up the proper way to be truly AI native, right? So focus on the value, focus on ensuring that you understand what it takes to build this sustainably. And we
Mm-hmm.
talk about that a lot. And this is, why, you should partner with us, because what you'll find is that you'll start using AI in the right way and set it up
Mm-hmm.
correctly as opposed to using an AI in the wrong way that looks impressive but doesn't add any value. And I'll give you a basic example. One of my pet hates is when people use AI to write emails.
Mm-hmm.
It looks really impressive. And now I'm reading through one page of an AI transcript, and it hasn't changed my decision. It hasn't changed my action. And if you wrote 2 lines badly worded, you'd get the same action. You get the same decision from me. So
Mm-hmm.
don't fall into the trap of because it looks impressive, it must add value. It's really
Mm-hmm.
about focus on the value, right? Make that value sustainable through doing the right things and implementing AI in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you'll actually get there.
It makes a ton of sense. So, a couple things I want to pull apart there because again, we're very philosophically aligned on this topic because I think about it in a similar way, right? You're working backwards from value and solving problems and, applying the technology where it can add value. And a couple things I want to touch on. One is this idea that, you don't necessarily need to start with like the big bang right away, right? And I think that one of the things I've noticed about this area and the different use cases that emerge is sometimes like the simplest stuff, which maybe to your point doesn't seem that impressive, actually can have a huge lift. Like one of my favorite like little examples for LLMs is, okay, you might not want like a voice LLM that's just riffing with the customer live in real time with no systems or guardrails wrapped around it. Like that would probably be a bad idea. It's probably going to do something at some point that is going to cause an issue for you or potentially with your regulators. However, like if you were to segment that entire process of someone calling into the call center and like all the steps they go through and just pick out like, okay, where today are we just terrible at doing the job that customers are asking us to do? And a simple example might be, well, when they call in and they get the IVR, even the best IVR system is horrible at interpreting natural language when they say, tell us why you're calling today. Like it just doesn't work. And it's one of those examples where, ideally you'd want a human answering it, but we're not going to do that because that's just not efficient. We want it to be intelligent because we want to give as much flexibility to the customer as possible. But a machine learning based IVR system that's trying to listen and interpret the natural language here, it just can't do the job. And so what if you just plugged an LLM in solely for the purpose of being able to interpret flexibly the natural language it hears in an IVR scenario, and then be able to route those options down the correct decision tree without changing anything on the back end? Like if it's just that interface layer, that's small. And it might seem kind of silly, or it might seem like, sometimes I think a thing that happens is, well, like I can't go to my board of directors and tell them that's our use case for AI. They want to see like real AI use case. It's like, no, that is a real AI use case. It's something where you are knocking out a real point of friction and doing it in a way that kind of mitigates the risks of how this technology can go wrong. What are some other examples you've come across where it's like small wins, low hanging fruit, stuff that just sort of is like, oh, obviously we should be doing it this way?
Yeah. And I can think of many examples as that. It is an evolution, right? Mm-hmm. And we go from ad hoc to augmented, right? Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much where we are in terms of augmenting the process, making our processes much better. And to your point, something like as simple as taking all of your documents and all of your policies, right, and putting them into one place and just being able to query them in natural language. What should I do in this particular, instance? I did this training 3 or 4 years back. I can't remember, so I need to ask someone, and it comes back in natural language and say, okay, this is what you should be doing for this particular scenario. So all of those training documents, all of those policies, you can put them together, and an agent actually tells you, okay, this is where you very, very simple use case, nothing sexy about it, but adds a huge amount of value, right? If you're shaving seconds off a call, if you're incrementally making the call more quality, giving the human agent time to focus on the client rather than navigating systems and navigating processes and policies, right? It's a better outcome. But again, so adding huge value, but not necessarily looking great, some really low-hanging fruit. And when we start doing that, we start building momentum. We start building foundations. And I think from what we're going to see is from augmented, it's going to go to elevated. So now we're going to start reimagining processes. We're going to start making it better. And then we'll get to autonomous and fully autonomous. But I think, it's almost like you can't skip the steps. In my mind, you have to follow the right steps and you evolve, in the right way. I think sometimes skipping the steps, while it might work, might open you up to risk at some point in time.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And I think the other thing that you mentioned earlier that I just wanted to circle back on is I love the sports analogy of, look, we're playing soccer here. And the part that looks incredible is in the game, at the end of the game, when you need a goal and there's a great pass and the person runs right into the right spot and it's a perfect goal. And it's just like, oh my God, that's amazing. And what you don't see are all the things that went in to getting the people to that position. And to apply that analogy a little bit more specifically, it strikes me that a lot of the things that a great like sports team does to put itself in that position at the end of that game in the final match is actually very similar to the processes that any company goes through to put its people in the right place, right? And I'm thinking about it in terms of like people, equipment, and processes, right? And the equipment is just, hey, we want to have good shoes, we want to have good jerseys, we want to have good, training equipment, all that kind of stuff. Every organization has technology they use to do their jobs better. But then there's the people. And then most importantly, that thing that's the bottom of the iceberg that you don't see that you're talking about is, what are all of the processes and the culture that we have that puts those people in the best position? How do we train? How do we draft players? How do we evaluate skill sets? How do we practice? Like all of those things go into that. And as you were describing kind of the guardrails and the data and the things necessary for LLMs, it struck me that if you run a really great collection shop where the humans you bring into your collection shop have the training data that they need and the policies well documented and the clear processes that articulate when you have discretion to make a decision and when to send it to a decision engine. And when you're sending it to a decision engine, what do you ask and what do you wait for? And when do you escalate that to your manager? Like all of that process, which is that hidden iceberg for a collection shop that works for people, isn't that exactly what LLMs need to be successful? I mean, one of the things, I guess one of the mistakes that I'm kind of pointing out here is I think sometimes we treat LLMs much more like new equipment that we can add in and a lot less like new people that we can add in. And yet, like the inputs and the guardrails necessary to get the best out of LLMs much more reflect the inputs and guardrails necessary to get the best out of people, not out of equipment. What do you think about that theory?
You touch on a point that I'm really, really passionate about. And it's amazing how aligned we are on this.
I know.
Because I think one of the issues that are caused is we treat AI as a system. And it's an intelligence. So we have to borrow a lot more from how we treat human beings, right?
Yes.
In terms of how we think about and manage intelligence, right? And I think that becomes a fundamental difference in terms of how we manage this, right? So we would say, oh, AI hallucinates, right? And, so many percentages gets wrong. Yes, because it's reasoning. It's using intelligence, right?
Yes.
If you stifle that, you're making it into a system. But guess what? That wonderful generative ability to do some amazing things, you're going to restrict that as well. So
humans hallucinate, right? We all hallucinate. We don't call it that. We call it making a mistake or being dumb or whatever, but we hallucinate too. We make mistakes.
Yeah. Correct. And that's exactly it. So you've got to again use this in terms of what it's good for, right? And complement it where it's lagging. So if you've got a decision that you can maybe get wrong, right? So the next Netflix suggested video.
Sure.
Right.
Sure.
You get that wrong. It's not a problem, right? You get a credit decision wrong in terms of whether I give you a $50,000 credit card. That is a bit of an issue, but you don't necessarily have to use the same AI technology for that purpose. And when you start thinking about the different AI technologies out there, and start combining them into a framework and an ecosystem. Again, something we consistently obsessing about is creating this framework. That's where magic can really happen, because now it's not down one particular path. I'm siloed, I'm restricted. You shouldn't feel restricted. You should feel like there's all of these possibilities. And the only restriction is how fast can I move? How do I want to test and learn? And really, aim for value rather than focusing on all of these technical nuances.
I think that's right. And I think that, one of the things that's interesting kind of big picture, and I love the idea of thinking about AI more in terms of how we think about and manage intelligence than how we think and manage systems. I think that's exactly right. Is, okay, so we're going to apply this intelligence to our organization. Collections at the end of the day is still a very people-centric business. Even though we've wrapped a lot of operational efficiency and a lot of automation and a lot of digital communications channels and decisioning systems around it, at the end of the day, there are still people talking to other people, trying to help them solve problems and trying to help them get back on track. I guess my view is I don't anticipate LLMs completely eliminating the job of like a human being working in a collection shop. But I'm curious where you think that will kind of net out in terms of how, let's call it silicon-based intelligence versus human intelligence, like how those two things will interact in a collections context.
Mhm.
And in particular, one of the things I'm curious about is, we always kind of wonder like what the outer limits are of, hey, I called into this place because I'm having a problem and I want to resolve my payment, or I want to come up with a new plan to make payments or get back on track or whatever. Like, is there a world in which I'm going to be perfectly happy having a empathetic, engaging conversation with silicon intelligence without ever talking to a human? Will I still prefer to talk to a human, even if there's no real rational reason? Because that's just kind of how human beings are sometimes. Like, what's your take on long term how these two forms of intelligence kind of merge together?
So it depends on how far in the future you're looking. My personal view, right,
Yeah.
is that might actually be not a human discussion at all. Customers
Because I'll
will
have
have
an agent on
agents.
the other half.
You'll
Yeah.
have an agent. I'll have an agent.
Yeah.
They will work out the best thing. And if there's a human in the loop, it'd be like, are you happy with this outcome? Yes, we're
And
happy
by the
with that outcome.
way, I gotta say, it would deeply amuse me if those agent to agent conversations were still really polite and empathetic and stuff. Like, imagine, like, I understand how you're feeling.
Really?
Oh, well, thank you for acknowledging but they don't actually have any feelings. That would be hilarious, just based on what they were trained to do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think that will happen at some point. My personal view, but there's a journey to actually get there, right? What humans are absolutely good at is understanding the nuance, right? And being able to fit the nuance and understanding what are the boundaries and what do I need to do, right? So where I see it working well together is AI, massive amounts of data, right, can work very, very genuinely close to how a human being would actually interact. So which customers actually prefer chatting to an AI agent because they attach maybe some shame or some guilt or some judgment towards a human agent who has no problem either way and is low risk enough for me to only spend one interaction, right? If that interaction is going to lead to another human interaction, maybe I should rethink it if it's happening too often. So testing and learning, but having the customer and understanding the customer to be able to drive that, I think will be really, really important in terms of what it works. And that mix could be very different, right? Depending on your market, depending on your region, depending on what your book shape is and what your clients are like, that may be different. But again, coexist in a world where, okay, if I want to do this, absolutely, for the bulk of it, I can use AI because most of the time it's simple and straightforward cases. But where it's a little bit more nuanced, where I need to understand certain things, if I can listen for keywords, right, and suddenly, a huge word around an illness or something pops up, like, hold on, I need to transfer this person to a human being, right? Those sort of things, an advanced ecosystem can work really, really well. Again, it's how do you complement it, but what does your customer want? And if they want fully autonomous AI, then I say go for it. If they feel like there's some nuance to it, that's also true. And if your customers make zero arrangements because they don't like talking to an AI, well, that's telling as well. But that will guide your decision, right?
That makes sense. So let's wrap up with a couple of pieces of advice, maybe that you can give to folks who are listening. The first one I want to ask you about is build versus buy, because it's funny. I've been spending a lot of time lately thinking about build versus buy, and one of the things that strikes me as really interesting is that AI really muddles that decision. Because on the one hand, I think that if you're thinking about build, there's a level of build with AI that's not going to be doable for any organization, right? No one's building their own foundation models. That's just not going to happen. But even beyond that, you might think, all right, well, can we build our own agents? Can we build our own agentic system? Can we build our own sort of AI powered customer communication platform, what have you? And, in some senses, I think build is more accessible to organizations because now, I mean, like, I don't know if you've been vibe coding at all, but like I'm vibe coding now and like I can build my own software products. It's fantastic. And yet at the same time, uh, my vibe coding products are not in any way like enterprise ready software. And it would take a tremendous amount of work to get them there. And I'm curious, like, as you look at how organizations are navigating this sort of build versus buy decision in the age of AI, do you see more of them leaning in kind of a like vibe coding, let's build it internally ourselves using these tools direction? Do you see them leaning more on like vendors to kind of help them navigate like what's real and what's kind of just kind of hype in
Mm.
AI? Like how should you approach making that decision?
Yeah. So again, if we probably look at all of the things that I listed in terms of what
Mm-hmm.
you need to build from a foundational capability, right, and take that into how we look at it from an intelligence aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So my daughter actually wants to study economics and anthropology, so she's actually been discussing a lot of the stuff with me. And intelligence has always been shared. The way intelligence has evolved was being shared. I mean, we didn't build things from scratch. We started I can take that in shared intelligence on how to make fire, and I can use it within this context. So our progression has really been built on shared intelligence, right? So now we take that further, right? If I've got the time and the money to invest, right, in building, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then you can
Mm-hmm.
build. But there's a huge opportunity here, right, to actually work on shared intelligence, right? Somebody who's actually done that sort of thinking, somebody who's gone through those type of challenges, right? And I don't have to
Mm-hmm.
do that. Why do I have to do that if I don't have to? If it's cost effective for me, I'm going to go with the easier option because what that
Mm-hmm.
gives us is fundamentally doing what we need to do. And it's a question I always ask: what is your business, right? And if your
Mm-hmm.
business is collections, then you need to spend your time focusing on how you best get the right outcomes from a customer point of view, from a cost point of view, and from a risk outcome, right? And that's your business. Do you really want to focus on, hold on, how do I link these data elements together? How do I string this framework together? Oh, there's a new way of actually engaging with data. Now I need to
Mm.
add all of that overhead onto it, right? And it's always funny. People will be like, "Oh, but I can build this agent myself." It's like, okay, are you able to manage 100 agents, AI agents? Because that's where you're going
Right.
to end up. So how are you monitoring them? How are you managing them? What are those guardrails? So it takes a
Mm-hmm.
ton of work to make value adding AI look easy, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah.
again, it's easy. I mean, I fall for it. I'm like, I go to our engineering team. It's like, look what I was able to build in just a few minutes. Can we do
Totally.
that? And then they
Totally.
go like,
Yeah.
Naeem, what about this? Okay, all right.
Right,
Um,
right. Oh
just
yeah,
bring me
that's
back
that's
down
a
to
good
earth.
point.
Yeah, exactly. Bring
Totally,
me down to
totally.
earth.
Well,
Yeah,
no, I mean it's a great point, right? Because it's again going back to this idea that you're bringing in intelligence, not systems.
yeah.
I think the analogy is it's more akin to, hey, like going to someone in your organization tomorrow, we could hire 10,000 more kind of low level employees to just join the company. Does that sound good? And they're like, no, that sounds like it would be chaos. That would ruin our entire organization. You would overrun us with things we had to manage and systems that were breaking because we had too many people touching all the different knobs and levers and dials. And the difference between that and saying, hey, what if we engage the services of an external staffing company who could bring us a lot more people and a lot more help, but bring it to us in a structured way that fits into our existing systems and our existing processes? Like, I think that's kind of the analogy here, right? Is you're
Yeah,
importing intelligence. Do you want to do it in a structured way that's going to be easy to manage? Or do you just want to bring 10,000 people off the street tomorrow to work in your company? Like,
absolutely.
cost isn't necessarily the issue, but management of all of those resources is.
Exactly. And what often happens, and if you I can remember far back when I just started out my career. We
Mm-hmm.
in the 90s, the business would sit with a developer and they would get
Mm.
stuff done within a day. This is what I want. The developer intrinsically understood the
Mm-hmm.
actual context and they were able to do things really, really quickly. And over time, oh, that developer left and we don't know what he's been done. So then we built in processes of documenting a business analyst. The whole job kind of created a whole new
Yeah.
role for documenting requirements to be able to
Yeah.
understand and have some documentation on how those systems have developed. We're sitting with a similar kind of choices here, right? If you
Mm.
want to make this sustainable, right, then you have to do the hard yards to actually do that, or else we're going to end up in the same position. We're going to end
Mm.
up with complex legacy software that we
Mm-hmm.
just want to remove. And then we want to go into this big transformational build where we buy some big enterprise software.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're going to go through that cycle again for people that don't really take that lesson or are young enough not to remember
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that was a problem. And I think we're going to have the same situation. So it's really about taking some of those lessons in the past and just not going through the same process again.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. The number of times it's like, no, guys, we've already done this. We've already solved this problem. I know it looks a little different because now it's AI, but it's
Yeah,
fundamentally the same problem.
yeah.
Um, all right, before I let you go, two quick
Mm,
questions. First one, what is a question that you wish more executives would ask before deploying AI in collections?
mm. So I that's interesting. I have a lot of empathy having been in similar discussions, right? You've got so much of pressure coming from different sources. So I empathize if cost and is what you have from high above what the analysts have set the expectations or you set the expectations to the analysts,
Sure, sure.
what is you've actually promised the board, your actual shareholders, that differs. But I
Mm-hmm.
would say the one thing is when you go back to your team, it's almost like what value is this adding, right?
Mm,
How, if you could reimagine this process, what would that process look like? So it's a lot more, not so much external questions, but internal questions. Are we looking at the problem correctly? Are we looking at it from the right perspective? Are we looking at it to add value, right? Or are we just looking at it from a cool tech implementation or a tick in the box? Hey, we've implemented AI. We're not behind, um,
right,
and your P&L isn't going to care how
right,
elegantly you did it. It's all about
right,
adding that value, right?
right, right.
So I would say that's probably where the questions that I would like to the executives actually be asking.
That makes sense. I totally agree with that, and it's challenging to do that. As much as it sounds good. It's always hard to resist those external pressures. How about regulators? We haven't talked a ton
Yeah.
about them, but obviously all of this is going to overlap with
Hmm.
sort of evolving regulatory compliance, and this is also new that I don't know that anyone quite
Yeah.
knows exactly what the shape of it is yet. What's one question you wish regulators would ask more consistently about AI in
Yeah.
collections?
My view is I've always supported regulators to a degree, for sure. I know sometimes it frustrated me as an operational person,
Sure, sure.
but it's there to
Hmm.
maintain competition, to look out for the customer, to ensure
Yep.
there's no bias, things are done right. And I think again, it's focusing on those outcomes, right? Maybe not focus less on the tech and how that's happening, but as long as those outcomes are not being breached, then I think we're okay. So again, my consistent view is focus less on the technology, right? But just make sure that we have the right outcomes. Yes, we're not leaking customer data. We are not, doing anything that is actually wrong by the customer or is unfair or unethical. Yeah, let's keep those guardrails in place. Absolutely. But again, that's the purpose of what we need to do and less about managing the tech.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well, focus on outcomes and the customer and not on the technology is a great tagline, I think, Naeem, for our entire conversation. I could talk to you a lot more about this since I think we are deeply aligned on this subject, but I will let you go. Thank you, sir, for taking the time. This was great.
Oh, thank you, Alex, for having me. It's been a blast.